Hello listeners, I'm Sam with Below the Radar, a knowledge democracy podcast. Below the Radar is recorded on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. On this episode of Below the Radar, our host Amjo Hall is joined by Miwa Matreyek, an animator, designer, performer and assistant professor in theatre production and design at SFU's School for the Contemporary Arts. Am and Miwa discuss how she got into making interdisciplinary artwork and some of her recent projects that combine animation and live performance. Enjoy the episode!
Hello, welcome to Below the Radar. Delighted you could join us again this week. We have a special guest. Miwa Matreyek is with us. Welcome, Miwa.
Thank you. Hi.
Wondering if we can start with you introducing yourself a little bit.
Yeah, I'm Miwa Matreyek. I'm an artist who recently transplanted to Vancouver. Well, recently, like 3 years ago. And I teach at SFU in the theater production design area at the School for the Contemporary Arts. I put animator first, animator, designer, performer. And I've been an independent touring artist since like 2010. I make performances that integrate projected animation and body on stage.
Yeah. Before I get into how you started working as an artist, it was a strange time to arrive here in Vancouver. It was sort of still in the pandemic zone. Wondering if you can speak a little bit to kind of the estrangement or strangeness of arriving to a new city and a school to work when the kind of pandemic resonances were still here.
For sure. I mean, when the pandemic hit in 2020, I had just premiered one of my pieces, Infinitely Horse, that I'd like to speak about. And, you know, I was like gearing up to have like the busiest touring schedule that I'd ever had. And then, of course, like, you know, just as I premiered it at Sundance, at the Red Cat, and a few other places, like everything shut down while I was touring. I landed in Maine and then like, I was on the car on my way to the show space. They're like, turn back, you can't come here anymore. And I was like alone in a hotel, like with all the news and then taking a flight back. I was at that time teaching in Philadelphia. So I was away for a term from my home in Los Angeles. I was alone. And I also found I was pregnant. So it was like a really disorienting time, like really scary time at the very beginning. And because I had lost all my, you know, contracts because of the pandemic, it was a time of like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? So in 2021, when the position opened up, you know, I had like a 4-month-old. And I always thought that I might be teaching at some point, but that definitely kind of like pushed me into like applying. And yeah, when we came to Vancouver, I was interviewed just on Zoom. So I kind of came sight unseen. Yeah, it was all kind of like new experiences and also kind of like reorienting myself and kind of re-identifying myself from, again, just being fully an artist to like, how do I figure out like this teaching self of myself, you know? And I had always kind of taught like workshops and stuff while I was touring because I was often touring in conjunction, like touring at like university performing arts centers. So there would be like engagement with students coming in to do performances and workshops and artist talks. So there was something that was kind of always adjacent to kind of getting into the academia. And I think it helped that I had that track history. But teaching fully, like building a syllabus and stuff was definitely new for me.
Yeah. And luckily you had a lot of colleagues who were starting roughly at the same time or just before. So a number of you have been very, very new to the school, which is really great. It's great energy at the school right now.
Yeah, and several with young kids too. So I think that really helped to kind of like feel grounded or feel like we have common experiences of figuring things out together.
Yeah. Wondering if we can chat about how did you first get, did you know that you wanted to be an artist? Were you always experimenting with work when you were younger, making things and performing?
Yeah. I feel like as an artist, at some point you look back and can see like the trajectory, like, you know, this like line to when you were just like doodling and, you know, tinkering. So I feel like I definitely see that from when I was a kid. I mean, when I was a kid, I feel like, yeah, I would like figure out how to make basically like a cranky, which I'm not sure if you know what a cranky is. It's basically like a box with like two things that you can wind, have a long piece of paper that's kind of winding for the other to have like a little story that gets revealed as you like turn the pegs, right? So I've always loved tinkering. I've always loved image making. and putting on some kind of show, like maybe not like performer, because I don't have a background in performance. I just happen to perform my own work. But I've always like loved that kind of problem solving and tinkering and creating images. And I feel like my work still is like very much, rooted in that. It's like that tinkering, figuring things out. How do I make something add a layer of complexity and make something that's like magical? And like magical is like kind of a fluffy word, but I feel like I'm always looking for magic. Still.
When did you start making work and showing it? Like right out of high school or university?
No.
Yeah.
From high school, and I think part of it was that I grew up in the Bay Area. I grew up in Japan until age 11 or so, and we moved to the Bay Area. So I was like, just between like San Francisco and San Jose and Redwood City. But the high school that I went to didn't really have a good art program. I took an art class in high school, but it didn't really seem like a viable thing. It was kind of like, whereas my physics teacher really cared, and he like, really supported us learning, like took us to go see like Star Trek movies, actually connected us with grad students at Stanford so we could shadow them and like see their work. And I would go to the observatory there and like take pictures of the moon and like Jupiter and stuff. And so I definitely always had an interest in the sciences. So actually going into undergrad, I was actually a physics major, like very much inspired from my physics teacher at high school. And after having done that for 2 years, I felt like it was like, I think there was always kind of an inevitability that I was going to end up in the arts. And I was in denial of it because I was like, that's not a viable thing to do. Kind of feeling very practical minded. I was like, I don't know, a Japanese kid or Asian kid. Not that my parents put pressure on me, but I think I put pressure on myself. But then, yeah, from my second or kind of going into my third year in undergrad, I switched to art. And in the arts, I was just kind of taking a broad spectrum of things like photo, painting, printmaking, digital illustration. And then collage became a way that I could kind of combine all these things and like cut them out and put them back together into like collage and assemblage. And at the time I was also like very much interested in kind of like riot girl kind of punk culture and like zine making. So like taking things that I've made and some found things, photos and drawings and found things and like making Xerox copies and using degradation to kind of like turn them into like zine or prints was something that was like sort of like the beginning of my like the practice that came out of that. And then once I started making collages and then I made collage in the computer, I realized how easy it is to move them. And that kind of led into animation. And then once I started making animation, I realized that I was kind of drawn to always like kind of integrating myself into it somehow. It's like, like a photo of myself, but then like combining all these buildings on top of my head or something. So that led into me just like videoing myself, rotoscoping it, so cutting out my figure or like just my hand or just my foot or whatever, and then creating like this kind of surrealist moving image animation that also has a layer of like gesture and performance into it. And then that led into like, doing live performance with collage. So it's sort of like this through line of like adding complexity. How do I like add a little bit of magic or a little bit of liveness into things?
And I wonder if you can speak a little bit to how your practice has evolved from when you were first showing work to now, because obviously you've been at various universities, you've been exposed to other artists as well, but how your thinking also has shifted in the making of the work and the kind of material you're playing with.
Yeah, so I feel like my work had always had a little bit of like this like humanity versus nature, or like this like contentious relationship that we have and this complex relationship that we have in this contemporary world. And I feel like there was something about it kind of like always being couched in the more kind of a magical, kind of fantastical, childlike space. But I feel like as I continue to make work, realizing sort of the power that this kind of performance that mixes the fantastical and physical can feel kind of immediate for the audience, realizing that I want to use that medium to say something with it. So I think kind of coming to that awareness and like finding what I want to address with that has been sort of like the evolution or the growth with the practice. This Roommate itself was kind of like very much inspired by my awe of the universe, I've always, like, I feel like that kind of interest in physics and the science kind of reemerges as like, how do I tell this in like a very physical, visceral, imagistic way? And then Infinitely Yours is very much sort of dealing with my climate grief, and its images of the climate crisis just kind of like condensed into a 27-minute performance. So within that piece, there's like wildfires and flooding and oil spills and pollution and just garbage everywhere, or like plastic garbage everywhere. And how do I kind of like reconcile with that?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to come back to that piece in particular because it's one of your more recent pieces, but I wanted to bring up these places that while you were an emerging artist, places like Red Cat and others that were sort of important to the development of your practice. And wonder if you can speak to, whether it's Red Cat or other places that were sort of important in terms of your trajectory of making work as an artist.
Sure. So for the Red Cat, I want to contextualize that I spoke about undergrad, which was UC Santa Barbara, and then grad school was Cal Arts, which is just outside of Los Angeles, and that's where I've like developed the medium that I have now of like animation and performance. I went in for the experimental animation program, which additionally I was part of the integrated media program, so it was sort of like, if you're an animator who is interested in coding, or if you're a composer who is interested in audience participatory installation, it was sort of like this catch-all place where you could have conversations and see work that was a little bit outside of just like what could be kind of myopic practice of like being just within one department, where, like in the animation school, it could be like, we just talk about walk cycles, we talk about frame rates, but then it's like, how do we have conversations outside of that? How do you get critique on your work from like dancers and like theater people and writers? So I think that was one of the things that helped kind of open up my practice, as well as just like finding collaborators while I was in grad school. So post Cal Arts, and this is like a common trajectory for a lot of people who graduate from Cal, you just roll down the hill into Los Angeles. So I did that. And there's definitely like a wonderful community of like recent grads and like people who had been out from long for Cal Arts. So those are sort of the folks that, we kind of supported each other. Like, a lot of them found spaces and like smaller festivals and stuff like that. Red Cat, which is the Roy, Edna, and Cal Arts Theater, which opened, I think, while I was in school or just before, because I was in grad school from 2004 to 2007. So that's in downtown Los Angeles. And even though it has the Cal Arts name in it, it's not necessarily like, it's not a theater for a Cal Arts. It's not like it only shows student work. It barely shows student work. But, it's like an international performing arts presentation theater. And Mark Murphy, who was the executive director at the time, also he was there for the founding of, and like, the early kind of conception of Red Cat. He made sure that there was support for the Los Angeles community, the arts community. As I graduated and kind of being in proximity with Red Cat, I showed first in the studio series, which is like the Work in Progress Emerging Artist Presentation Series Festival. And I feel like each person got like maybe 10 to 12 minutes to show like a little excerpt of something on a stage, on the professional stage, get audience and like get like documentation of your work. But that's the one that's very much sort of like for the emerging artists. The next level was Now Festival, and that's a 3-week festival with each weekend having 2 or 3 artists at a time, and you get like more financial support to complete the work. And that's again like a work in progress festival, but sort of like emerging into more established artists showing their work. And then eventually I got my own shows. So kind of feeling that like step-by-step support and kind of being given like this kind of like ladder to kind of go up each rung. Mark Murphy has also written like a number of like recommendation letters for me or for my theater company for grants and stuff like that. So like really feeling that kind of support for supporting, for assisting the emerging artists in Los Angeles through the Red Cat.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to come back to your work, Infinitely Yours, because it's one of the more recent works that you've done. If you could speak a little bit more to how you conceptualized it and the development of the work before it ever was performed.
Infinitely Yours. Another context I want to build in is that while I was in Cal Arts, I I started collaborating with a directing student named Chi Wang Young and a music composer performer student named Anna Huff, otherwise known as Anna Oxygen. And so we met in the integrated media program, and we started collaborating, and it was work that had nowhere that like it wasn't for homework for, it wasn't a project in any of our classes. It was sort of independent. And we started making, 15, 20-minute performances, multimedia performances that integrated theater, animation, and music, live music. And we had so much fun making that and just like being at a state of play with all these different mediums and studios that we made a piece per year that we were in school, so 3 pieces. And so that was also what led me to realizing that, I want to also do this with my own stuff. So kind of like having this parallel narrative of the theater company that we later called Quality Control and my own solo work. And they kind of like have some difference in like scale, of course, 3 and 1. The work that we're making that led into like more kind of like larger theater productions where we had to like hire lighting designers and producers and stuff like that. And then mine kind of just stayed in this like very solo track. So for a while, I was kind of doing one and then doing the other and kind of like getting this balance of like working in a collaborative space to kind of going away back into my cave and making my own work. So going back to Infinitely Yours, it kind of came out of making a piece called Half-Life with my theater company, and which was inspired by the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster and thinking about like contamination and pollution, man-made disasters, safety, and authority about who could tell us like what's safe and what's not. We say that it was inspired by, because it's not necessarily about that, but it's kind of like deals with all that. Again, like this complexity of like our modern world in this time of climate crisis and man-made disasters. And as we were finishing that, I knew that I wanted to make my own piece, again, kind of like that balance of like the group work into my own work. So from like 2015 or so, as we premiered that piece, I was starting to just like catalog and collect a whole bunch of articles about climate crisis. And I feel like maybe it was just me, but from like about 2014 or so, I felt like there was an influx of news pieces about like elements of the climate crisis, manifestation of the climate crisis, like wildfires and flooding and droughts, and how it just felt more and more undeniable. And I knew that I wanted to make a piece that deals with how I feel about it. So I just use an app called Evernote just to kind of catalog and archive all these. I was touring my previous work, so I didn't really have time to just sit down and start making things, but it was sort of like this world building of the real world and like images of all these different aspects of climate crisis in different places in the world. I mean, being in Los Angeles, like one of the ones that I had the most immediate relationship was wildfires, right? Because I would be in a traffic jam in the summer and see like 3 plumes of wildfire smoke in the distance and be like, oh, there's one up there and there's one over there. I just have like a really specific image of that. So then I was just kind of collecting stuff. And then it really led until like 2018 when I did have some space and some support and funding, as well as like kind of forcing myself to make a deadline by applying to Now Festival. And knew that I had to make at least like a 20-minute section to start creating the work. And then it took like almost all of 2019 to like continue working and premiere in 2020. But again, it's like the inspiration was like just the news.
Yeah. And so I know you've traveled with the work to multiple sites, and I'm wondering if you can speak just a little bit too, as you develop a work, you take it out into the world, the kind of feedback and reception you've had with it.
So it's a work that, integrates all these like images, again, of climate crisis. And I talk about how it's kind of about like my own climate grief. Often the images that's incorporated into it are things from my own life, including like a lot of the trash that I animate is like my own plastic trash that I filmed in these loops so I can make them look like they're tumbling out in a landfill or kind of pouring out of my body or rolling with the waves in a plastic-filled ocean. And so there was a lot of things that felt very personal to me. And it's not a piece that really offers a solution, And I wondered, like I was reading The Drawdown, I think that's what the book was called. And kind of looking at these solutions, but I'm like, I'm not sure how to integrate that or if it feels like I'm just kind of tacking it on. as someone who was like maybe didn't really feel like I had the authority to like speak on that. So I kind of consider the piece when I perform it with the audience as sort of like a collective exorcism of kind of like confronting all these ways that we feel grief and, you know, these complex emotions around like what's happening in the world, as well as a little bit of like our own choices that we make, and maybe creating a feeling of catharsis just to kind of be in a shared space with that, even if I'm not necessarily showing images of like solutions, and hopefully at least conversations about solutions or just awareness. But yeah, I feel like for me, it's a kind of a downer piece. But I've also heard from audiences how they found it uplifting.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. You know, we had John Valiant on as a guest, and he wrote the book called Fire Weather, which is about the Fort McMurray fire. And he talks a little bit about, you know, families losing their homes and their family photos and children, and like the loss of the personal archive. And at the same time, the sort of madness and proliferation of the fire produces its own natural archive, and this sort of dissonance that happens. It's quite a page turner for a book about you know, fire. And certainly California has had more than its share of wildfires. The ones that get to the edge of the Getty and all of that. It's very intense to see the physical side of it. And of course, in BC here, we've had Lytton burned down. All of it. I've had a chance to visit there, and also at Fort McMurray when the fires happened there, and just seeing the physical side of the aftermath, the burnt out cars, all of that. It's very, the feeling is very apocalyptic, and yeah, there's so many things that are unregistered or not fully thought through in terms of the impacts we're going to be going through in the next few years. So in many ways, I suppose artistic interventions can help us think that through.
Yeah. And it's also fascinating, or it strikes me every time I perform it that there's some image in there that feels like really immediate in the moment. Of course, like it opens with wildfire because, you know, of course, it's like what feels like for me the closest, and I've had friends who's like lost their homes in the wildfires. But then, you know, as I was making it, as I was performing it, you know, there's like the fires in like Australia and the Amazon. It's just like, it just feels like, oh, this image is of course like what's in the news right now again, repeatedly, and other images in the piece too. So it's kind of intense to share that and know that it's like has this this, you know, like this like, ooh, like I see it in the news and I see it in the performance.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, just in terms of you know, arriving into a school and beginning to teach here, there is all these new faculty members here at the school, which is really fantastic. And wondering how you think through a curriculum that resonates today in the area of the school you're in, and just kind of, you know, given your own influences, how to, you know, there's so many new technologies that have come into play from when the school was first set up. And so trying to think that through, and also kind of maintain and rejuvenate its own histories to be relevant as a school.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, I'm sure any of the new faculty, but I think any faculty at any point, because it's like the school has a like this like line, this through line that's happening, and you kind of drop into it, so you kind of learn about the history, but then you can't necessarily do that. Like you have to find your own way. So I am like really grateful to be in an area where Vlad, I think, is maybe approaching his 5th year, and I think Kyla's maybe like has been here for 6 or 7 years. So we're all relatively new and trying to redefine this program with like who we are. And, you know, of course, like I don't even come from a theater background. I come as an animator who happens to perform, and also have a theater company. So I have like that touring experience as well. But, you know, there's a lot in theater that I don't actually know about. So I'm trying to find my niche of what I could teach, which I think is about like, again, like that tinkering and problem solving, and of course, image making. And I think also play, like a playfulness that I'd like to bring to things. So yeah, we're like proposing new classes that's kind of centered more around moving image for performance and installation. And that's been really fun to do. And it's also interesting kind of like because other areas of the school, like let's say dance, it's very clear what you're coming in for and what you want to do, like you want to dance. And I know like within that there's like some variation, but for the theater production design area, I feel like it's a lot more open-ended, and there are some people who are like very technical, like they want to, do like lighting design, or they want to like operate, like video software, to people who are like very much in the handmade world, or people who want to be stage managers. And it's been really interesting to kind of like work with different kinds of people and see them, like some people, especially in their first year, I might see them struggle in one class, but then kind of like find their niche and like really blossom. And sometimes that's my class where I'm like, oh, wait, like you're really enjoying using Photoshop and After Effects and like doing really cool things. So that's been really fun. Yeah. And I think also that with a lot of what we do in the classes, there is this like kind of state of like layered problem solving. That's like, how do we build this analog thing? And then how do we conceive of like a digital animation that's in context with an analog thing, and then make a performance where you kind of take the digital back into an analog space? And it seems like the students are having fun with that, which I'm really thankful for.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of, taking on a job inside of a university, I speak to a lot of, artist friends of mine who've, moved into faculty roles, that kind of thing. The challenge, of course, always ends up being is how do you carve out the time and space to continue producing your own work when the demands of the institution around teaching, research, administration can sometimes get in the way of that. How have you tried to carve out space to be able to continue to make your own work?
Yeah, so I think that's a question I'm still trying to figure out, and yeah, I'm not sure if I ever have an answer, because also having a young child, she's 3.5 years old, so I feel like there was like a Instagram meme thing that I saw that was like, about where it's like you can't do more than 2 things at once, and teaching and like family. Something has to suffer in order for me to have I don't want to use the word suffer, but something is like kind of carved away in order to make this third thing happen. And I have done that a little bit. Like I've did video projection design for an opera festival in South Carolina, Spoleto Festival, that premiered last May. So that was like kind of carving time away a little bit from the teaching, and mainly from like doing any bedtime or anything with my daughter for like, 2.5 months or so to premiere this thing. And, there's a way that it's really hard to do that. Last summer, I taught intersession, so that kind of carved away from like time, my creative time. So I'm really looking forward to having this summer. You asked me earlier if I'm going anywhere. I'm like, well, just a little bit, but I really just want to be here while my daughter's in daycare to have like that daytime time to actually like have creative time for myself. At this point, I'm just trying to figure out how I can, I'm not sure if what I make will be just experiments. Sometimes the experiments that I do in the summer are just kind of leading into things I might do in class, right? So it still like feels kind of like my own, but it's kind of just like setting myself up to have like a more of a demo and example leading into class. So I think a lot of the ideas I have right now that I want to do are just stuff like that, not necessarily like I'm making a giant new piece that normally takes me like a year or more, like basically working full time on it, which I don't have that time now. Or if I'm able to like make it just stretched out over summer, like many, many summers. But I think right now I just really want to reconnect with my creative self, or my kind of witchy self again, and just play.
Have you ever in the past, or would you in the future, collaborate with physicists?
I would love to. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that if I did, like if I'm kind of staying more in line with like my own performances, that it would be more like, again, like this imagistic and like performative, gestural, physical way of trying to understand something. There's a small planetarium at Griffith Park in Los Angeles at the top of the hill. It's this beautiful old building. And, there's a planetarium, you can see a planetarium show, but there's also like, all this like displays and installations that like talks about space. There's an observatory too, and they have like, special events where you could go into the observatory and like look at the moon or whatever. But there's a room that has displays about various planets, and there's like these scales that you could go on, and you could, like when you stand on it, it tells you like, this is how much you'd weigh on, Mercury because of like the gravity there versus how much you'd weigh on Jupiter. And those kinds of ways of like kind of thinking about what your body feels like in these like different macro and micro spaces is really fascinating to me. And I think that's something I'm approach with my performances often, both with some of the pieces that I've made, but I've also made smaller things for commissions where I'm like going from like the macro into the micro into quarks into like the unknown with my performance. And I think that kind of like visual problem solving, performative problem solving is really interesting for me.
Yeah. Do you have some things you're working on now or you're planning to do in the future, even if they haven't started?
I feel like there's only like rough ideas. I mean, there's a lot of like toy theater stuff that I like to do that's kind of leading up to classes I'd be teaching, as well as like moving image. I'm like, maybe I should just make a short film. It's a lot easier than making performance. But there's also a way that I'm fascinated. I feel like especially with my older work, that was kind of what I said, like more magical. I've kind of been kind of like TYA adjacent, like theater for young audience adjacent. And there's a way, especially now that I have a child, to be like, maybe I embrace that and make just like a total like, you know, a show for kids. I think that some of my newer work could be for a young audience and definitely has had young audiences, but there's some images in it that could be scary because it's about climate crisis or, you know, there's like creation and destruction. So I feel like from like maybe older elementary school up, it's all good and it like leads into like really interesting conversations. But maybe there's one that I make that's just like magical colors and shapes.
Miwa, thank you so much for sharing some of your work on Below the Radar.
Thank you. Thank you for this time and for your generosity for letting me speak about my work.
Below the Radar is a knowledge democracy podcast created by SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Thanks for listening to our episode with Miwa Matreyek. To find out more about Miwa's work, head to our show notes. If you would like to support our podcast, you can donate at the link in the description below. Your generous donation will help support the podcast's activities and associated public events with SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next time on Below the Radar.